London, why? One of the world's wealthiest cities has become unaffordable. What would it feel like if living in one of the world's wealthiest cities became impossible? Today, I'm going to tell you about a place where this has become reality. The shocking situation unfolding in London, the capital of the United Kingdom. The reality behind the glamour. What comes to mind when you think of London? You probably imagine a beautiful city, with the Thames flowing through it, grand buildings, boasting hundreds of years of history as a global financial center. And you'd be right. London is certainly one of the world's most attractive cities. This massive city of 9 million inhabitants is home to over 200,000 millionaires. It's one of the world's premier financial centers and the place where more private jets land than anywhere else in Europe. After all, it was once the heart of an empire on which the sun never set. But the reality hidden behind this glamorous facade is truly shocking. More than 1 in 4 residents of this city live below the poverty line. What's even more startling is that the number of rough sleepers is 8 times the national average. It rather makes a mockery of the title, World's Wealthiest City, doesn't it? Soaring housing costs. The biggest culprit is housing costs. As recently as 2017, London's average monthly rent was around £1,500. But now new tenants need to pay over £2,700 per month. That's an 80% explosion in rents in just 8 years. And that's in decent areas, mind you. What's even more galling is that, whilst the city is in the midst of its worst property crisis ever, nearly 45% of central London property purchases are being made by foreign buyers. Meanwhile, the people who actually need to live there are being pushed out. Crumbling dreams. In the past, London was a dream city for countless young Britons. It was where good jobs, unlimited opportunities, and a better future awaited. Indeed, for decades, millions of people flocked to London with these dreams. But now those dreams are being shattered one by one. Finding work has become far more difficult than before, and even if you do find it, you don't receive the same sort of treatment as you used to. Paradoxically, whilst enormous wealth exists in this city, the actual standard of living for ordinary people is the complete opposite of what it appears. Once you subtract housing costs, even high-earning Londoners fall into the bottom 5% for purchasing power across the whole of Britain. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, haven't risen at all since 2008. It's a bizarre situation where you earn more but can afford less. Crime born of desperation. This desperate reality is driving people to desperate actions. Over the past year, shoplifting in London has surged by 35%. That's the highest increase rate among all crime types. Now you can witness a strange sight in shops throughout London. Basic necessities like meat and washing powder, locked away in transparent plastic boxes. To prevent theft, you see. It's hard to believe this is happening. In the capital of what was once called the nation of gentlemen, many experts view London's current state as a symbol of the decline that the whole of Britain is experiencing. The root of the problem, 100 years ago. So how did London, once one of the world's wealthiest cities, become an impossible place for nearly everyone to live? To find that answer, we need to go back, surprisingly, nearly 100 years. Currently, Londoners spend an average of 46% of their income on housing costs. That's 50% more money spent on housing than in other parts of Britain. It's unsurprisingly an unbearable situation. Indeed, 1 in 4 Londoners is seriously considering leaving the city altogether next year because of extortionate rents. Remarkably, most of London's current housing problems began with a decision made nearly 100 years ago. That seemed rather unimportant at the time. The 1930s, the birth of the Greenbelt policy. Imagine London in the 1930s for a moment. Back then, the average house price was $500. That was about 3 times the average income. Compared to now, it was absolute heaven, really. In those days, the very concept of a housing crisis, as we know it today, didn't exist. Rather, people's concerns were the complete opposite. The issue wasn't whether enough houses were being built, but that the city was expanding into the countryside too rapidly, unstoppably even. London was thought to be devouring the beautiful surrounding countryside. Like some enormous monster, Britons of the time were tremendously proud of their country's rural landscape. They regarded the pastoral scenery of rolling meadows, quaint farms and dense woodlands as central to British identity. They couldn't just stand by and watch these precious landscapes disappear one by one as London continued to grow. Moreover, air pollution was a serious problem at the time. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution, London's air was thick with smoke and dust, and the winter smogs were particularly dreadful. If the city grew larger, the air quality was bound to worsen. The Greenbelt, an ideal solution. In this situation, the government decided to halt London's unchecked expansion. The solution they proposed was the Greenbelt policy. The idea was really quite simple and idealistic. Create a greenbelt around the city prohibiting development, thereby protecting the countryside, preserving air quality, and preventing the city from encroaching willy-nilly on rural land. Local authorities were given powers to purchase land around the capital and protect it permanently from house building. The goal was clear: preserve nature and keep urban life breathable. And at first, it achieved wonderful results. Even decades later, beautiful countryside still surrounds London. This is despite enormous demand for 1 million homes in the capital. Thanks to this policy, Londoners can still encounter idyllic English countryside, just a short journey from the city. Unforeseen side effects. But as time passed, the dark side of this policy began to emerge, particularly from the 21st century onwards. Completely unforeseen consequences appeared. The policymakers of the time probably never dreamt such things would happen. How much land is protected by the Greenbelt today? Astonishingly, it's 3 times the size of Greater London itself, a massive donut shape of land. Completely prohibited from development surrounds London. Not a single house can be built on all this land. What this ultimately means is clear. There's virtually no land where people can actually build houses. Demand is exploding, whilst the land available for supply is woefully inadequate. The severity of housing undersupply. When you look at the specific figures, it's even more shocking. London typically needs 52,000 new homes annually. That's because of population growth and household formation. But in reality, only about 30,000 are being built. That's a shortfall of 22,000 every year. As this situation has continued for decades, the accumulated housing deficit has reached an enormous scale. According to experts' calculations, to bring London up to the European average for per capita, housing stock would require an additional 1.1 million homes. But meeting this demand is virtually impossible because of planning restrictions. Whilst the Greenbelt policy achieved its noble goal of protecting nature, it unintentionally strangled housing supply completely. The 1980s, the beginning of social housing sales. But land shortage doesn't fully explain London's housing crisis. Whilst the undersupply caused by the Greenbelt is undeniable, a more fundamental change actually began much earlier, from the 1960s in fact. Abundant social housing. Until then, London's situation was completely different from today. In 1960s London, it wasn't just privately owned homes that were affordable. There was an enormous amount of social housing, directly owned and managed by the government. At the time, 1/3 of all British housing was publicly owned. There had been an explosive boom in house building after the Second World War. As war-ravaged cities were rebuilt, the government stepped in directly to construct large housing estates. The reason this policy worked is simple. Housing supply was plentiful, and the number of families wanting to buy in. The private market was relatively small. Because many people lived in affordable social housing, competition in the private housing market wasn't terribly fierce. Thatcher's right-to-buy scheme. But when the 1980s arrived, everything began to change. When Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, she brought in a completely new policy. It was the famous right-to-buy scheme, introduced through the 1980 Housing Act. This scheme was truly revolutionary. It gave millions of council house tenants the opportunity to purchase the homes. They were living in at discounts of up to 70%. In many respects, this policy was enormously successful. Home ownership in London soared from 55% in 1980 to 67% in 2003. Over 316,000 homes were sold in London alone. For many families, it was a genuinely life-changing opportunity. People who had spent their entire lives renting suddenly found themselves homeowners. For the working classes especially, it was like a dream come true. Owning one's own home provided not just economic benefits, but also self-esteem and security. To be continued in episode 2.